Good morning. This is Ron. It is Thursday, the 29th of March. Welcome to Storytime. And this is part two of Egalitarianism and Inflation, which is chapter 12 of Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand. In the first part of this chapter, Ayn Rand was going on about how egalitarianism and inflation are linked. And one of the examples that she gave was the example of a struggling farmer and a situation where a farmer is needs produce, but everybody else is, uh, because of inflation, other people have gone out of business, and how that affects the inflation basically affects everybody eventually. So one producer goes out of business, and then that affects the somebody else in the chain. They have to raise their prices, et cetera, et cetera. So part two. There is only one institution that can arrogate to itself the power legally to trade by means of rubber checks: the government. And it is the only institution that can mortgage your future without your knowledge or consent. Government securities and paper money are promissory notes on future tax receipts, i.e., on your future production. Now, project the mentality of a savage who can grasp nothing but the concretes of the immediate moment and who finds himself transported into the midst of a modern industrial civilization. If he's an intelligent savage, he will acquire a smattering of knowledge, but there are two concepts he will not be able to grasp: credit and market. He observes that people get food, clothes, and all sorts of objects simply by presenting pieces of paper called checks. And he observes that skyscrapers and gigantic factories spring out of the ground at the command of very rich men, whose bookkeepers keep switching magic figures from the ledgers of one to those of another and another and another. This seems to be done faster than he can follow, so he concludes that speed is the secret magic power of paper, and that everyone will work and produce and prosper so long as those checks are passed from hand to hand fast enough. If that savage breaks into print with his discovery, he will find that he has been anticipated by John Maynard Keynes. Then the savage observes that the department stores are full of wonderful goods, but people do not seem to buy them. Why is that? He asks a floor walker. Quote, "We don't have enough of a market," unquote, the floor walker tells him. Why is that? He asks. Well, his new teacher answers, quote, "Goods are produced for people to consume. It's the consumers that make the world go round, but we don't have enough consumers," unquote. Is that so? Says the savage, his eyes flashing with the fire of a new idea. Next day he obtains a check from a big educational foundation. He hires a plane, flies away, and comes back a while later, bringing his entire naked, barefoot tribe along. "You don't know how good they are at consuming," he tells his friend, the floor walker, "and there's plenty more where these came from. Pretty soon you'll get a raise in pay." But the store pretty soon goes bankrupt. The poor savage is unable to understand it to this day, because he had made sure that many, many people agreed with his idea, among them many noble tribal chiefs, such as Governor Romney, who sang incantations to consumerism, and warrior Nader, who fought for the consumer rights, and big business chieftain, who recited formulas about serving the consumers, and chiefs who sat in Congress, and chiefs in the White House, and chiefs in every government in Europe, and many more professors than he could count. Perhaps it is harder for us to understand that the mentality of that savage has been ruling Western civilization for almost a century. Trained in college to believe that to look beyond the immediate moment, to look for causes or to foresee consequences is impossible, modern men have developed context dropping as their normal method of cognition. Observing a bad small-time shopkeeper, the kind who is doomed to fail, they believe, as he does, that the lack of consumers is his only problem, and that the question of the goods he sells or where these goods come from has nothing to do with it. The goods, they believe, are here and will always be here. Therefore, they conclude, the consumer, not the producer, is the motor of an economy. Let us extend credit, i.e., our savings, to the consumers, they advise, in order to expand the market for our goods. But, in fact, consumers qua consumers are not part of anyone's market. Qua consumers, they are irrelevant to economics. Nature does not grant anyone an innate title of consumer. It is a title that has to be earned by production. Only producers constitute a market, only men who trade products or services for products or services. In the role of producers, they represent a market supply. In the role of consumers, they represent a market's demand. The law of supply and demand has an implicit subclause that it involves the same principle in both capacities. When this subclause is forgotten, ignored, or evaded, you get the economic situation of today. A successful producer can support many people, in essence, his children, by delegating to them his market power of consumer. Can that capacity be unlimited? How many men would you be able to feed on a self-sustaining farm? In more primitive times, farmers used to raise large families in order to obtain farm labor, i.e., productive help. How many non-productive people could you support by your own effort? If the number were unlimited, if demand became greater than supply, if demand were turned into a command, as it is today, you would have to use and exhaust your stock seed. This is the process now going on in this country. There's only one institution that could bring it about, the government, with the help of a vicious doctrine that serves as a cover-up, altruism. The visible profiteers of altruisms, the welfare recipients, are part victims, part window dressing for the statist policies of the government. But no government could have gotten away with it if people had grasped the other concept which the savage was unable to grasp, the concept of credit. If you understand the function of stock seed, of savings in a primitive farm community, apply the same principle to a complex industrial economy. Wealth represents goods that have been produced but not consumed. What would a man do with his wealth in terms of direct barter? Let us say a successful shoe manufacturer wants to enlarge his production. His wealth consists of shoes. He trades some shoes for the things he needs as a consumer, but he saves a large number of shoes and trades them for building materials, machinery, and labor to build a new factory, and another large number of shoes for raw materials and for the labor he will employ to manufacture more shoes. Money facilitates this trading, but does not change its nature. All the physical goods and services he needs for this project must actually exist and be available for trade, just as his payment for them must actually exist in the form of physical goods, in this case shoes. An exchange of paper money, or even of gold coins, would not do any good to any of the parties involved if the physical things they needed were not there and could not be obtained in exchange for the money. If a man does not consume his goods at once but saves them for the future, whether he wants to enlarge his production or to live on his savings, which he holds in the form of money, in either case he is counting on the fact that he will be able to exchange his money for the things he needs, when and as he needs them. This means that he is relying on a continuous process of production which requires an uninterrupted flow of goods saved to fuel further and further production. This flow is investment capital, the stock seed of an industry. When a rich man lends money to others, what he lends to them is the goods which he has not consumed. This is the meaning of the concept investment. If you have wondered how one can start producing when nature requires time paid in advance, this is the beneficent process that enables men to do it. A successful man lends his goods to a promising beginner or to any reputable producer in exchange for the payment of interest. The payment is for the risk he is taking. Nature does not guarantee man's success, neither on a farm nor in a factory. If the venture fails, it means that the goods have been consumed without productive return, so the investor loses his money. If the venture succeeds, the producer pays the interest out of the new goods, the profits, which the investment enabled him to make. Observe and bear in mind above all else that this process applies only to financing the needs of production, not of consumption, and that its success rests on the investor's judgment of men's productive ability, not on his compassion for their feelings, hopes, or dreams. Such is the meaning of the term credit in all its countless variations and applications. Credit means money, i.e., unconsumed goods, loaned by one productive person or group to another to be repaid out of future production. Even the credit extended for a consumption purpose, such as the purchase of an automobile, is based on the productive record and prospects of the borrower. Credit is not, as these savage believed, a magic piece of paper that reverses cause and effect and transforms consumption into a source of production. Consumption is the final, not the efficient, cause of production. The efficient cause is savings, which can be said to represent the opposite of consumption. They represent unconsumed goods. Consumption is the end of production and a dead end as far as the productive process is concerned. The worker who produces so little that he consumes everything he earns carries his own weight economically, but contributes nothing to future production. The worker who has a modest savings account and the millionaire who invests a fortune, and all the men in between, are those who finance the future. The man who consumes without producing is a parasite, whether he's a welfare recipient or a rich playboy. An industrial economy is enormously complex. It involves calculations of time, of motion, of credit, and long sequences of interlocking contractual exchanges. This complexity is the system's great virtue and the source of its vulnerability. The vulnerability is psycho-epistemological. No human mind and no computer and no planner can grasp the complexity in every detail. Even to grasp principles that rule it is a major feat of abstraction. This is where the conceptual links of men's integrating capacity break down. Most people are unable to grasp the working of their hometown economy, let alone the country's or the world's. Under the influence of today's mind-shrinking anti-conceptual education, most people tend to see economic problems in terms of immediate concretes, of their paychecks, their landlords, the corner grocery store. The most disastrous loss, which broke their tie to reality, is the loss of the concept that money stands for existing but unconsumed goods. The system's complexity serves occasionally as a temporary cover for the operation of some shady characters. You've all heard of some manipulator who does not work but lives in luxury by obtaining a loan, which he repays by obtaining another loan elsewhere, which he repays by obtaining another loan, etc. You know that his policy can't go on forever, that it catches up with him eventually and he crashes. But what if that manipulator is the government? The government is not a productive enterprise. It produces nothing. In respect to its legitimate functions, which are the police, the army, the law courts, it performs a service needed by a productive economy. When a government steps beyond these functions, it becomes an economy's destroyer. The government has no source of revenue except the taxes paid by the producers. To free itself, for a while, from the limits set by reality, the government initiates a credit con game on a scale which the private manipulator could not dream of. It borrows money from you today, which is to be repaid with money it will borrow from you tomorrow, which is to be repaid with money it will borrow from you the day after tomorrow, and so on. This is known as deficit financing. It is made possible by the fact that the government cuts the connection between goods and money. It issues paper money, which is used as a claim check on actually existing goods, but that money is not backed by any goods. It is not backed by gold. It is backed by nothing. It is a promissory note issued to you in exchange for your goods to be paid by you in the form of taxes out of your future production. Where does your money go? Anywhere and nowhere. First, it goes to establish an altruistic excuse and window dressing for the rest, to establish a system of subsidized consumption, a welfare class of men who consume without producing, a growing dead end imposed on a shrinking production. Then the money goes to subsidize any pressure group at the expense of any other, to buy their votes, to finance any project conceived at the whim of any bureaucrat or friends, to pay for the failure of that project, to start another, etc. The welfare recipients are not the worst part of the producer's burden. The worst part are the bureaucrats, the government officials who are given the power to regulate production. They are not merely unproductive consumers. Their jobs consist in making it harder and harder and ultimately impossible for the producers to produce. Most of them are men whose ultimate goal is to place all producers in the position of welfare recipients. While the government struggles to save one crumbling enterprise at the expense of the crumbling of another, it accelerates the process of jiggling debts, switching losses, piling loans on loans, mortgaging the future and the future's future. As things grow worse, the government protects itself not by contracting this process, but by expanding it. The process becomes global. It involves foreign aid and unpaid loans to foreign governments, and subsidies to other welfare states, and subsidies to the United Nations, and subsidies to the World Bank, and subsidies to foreign producers and credits to foreign consumers to enable them to consume our goods, while simultaneously the American producers who are paying for it all are left without protection, and their properties are seized by any sheik in any pest hole of the globe, and the wealth they have created, as well as their energy, is turned against them, as, for example, in the case of Middle East oil. Do you think a spending orgy of this kind can be paid for out of current production? No. The situation is much worse than that. The government is consuming this country's stock seed. That stock seed of industrial production, investments capital, i.e., the savings needed to keep production going. These savings were not paper, but actual goods. Under all the complexities of private credit, the economy was kept going by the fact that, in one form or another, in one place or another, somewhere within it, actual material goods existed to back its financial transactions. It kept going long after that protection was breached. Today, the goods are almost gone. Piece of paper will not feed you when there is no bread to eat. It will not build a factory when there are no steel girders to buy. It will not make shoes when there is no leather, no machines, and no fuel. You've heard it said that today's economy is affected by sudden, unpredictable shortages of various commodities. These are the advanced symptoms of what is to come. You've heard economists say that they are puzzled by the nature of today's problem. They are unable to understand why inflation is accompanied by recession, which is contrary to their Keynesian doctrines. And they have coined a ridiculous name for it, stagflation. Their theories ignore the fact that money can function only so long as it represents actual goods, and that at a certain stage of inflating the money supply, the government begins to consume a nation's investment capital, thus making production impossible. The value of the total tangible assets of the United States at present was estimated in terms of 1968 dollars at $3.1 trillion. If government spending continues, that incredible wealth will not save you. You may be left with all the magnificent skyscrapers, the giant factories, the rich farmlands, but without fuel, without electricity, without transportation, without steel, without paper, without seeds to plant the next harvest. If that time comes, the government will declare explicitly the premise on which it has been acting implicitly, that its only real capital asset is you. Since you will not be able to work any longer, the government will take over and make you work on a slope descending to sub-industrial production. The only substitute for technological energy is the muscular labor of slaves. This is the way an economic collapse leads to dictatorship, as it did in Germany and in Russia. And if anyone thinks that the government planning is a solution to the problems of human survival, observe that after half a century of total dictatorship, Soviet Russia is begging for American wheat and for American industrial know-how. A dictatorship would find it impossible to rule this country in the foreseeable future. What is possible is the blind chaos of a civil war. It is a time like this, the face of an approaching economic collapse, that the intellectuals are preaching egalitarian notions. When the curtailment of government spending is imperative, they demand more welfare projects. When the need for men of productive ability is desperate, they demand more equality for the incompetents. When the country needs the accumulation of capital, they demand we soak the rich. When the country needs more savings, they demand a redistribution of income. They demand more jobs and less profits, more jobs and fewer factories, more jobs and no fuel, no oil, no coal, no pollution. But, above all, more goods for free to more consumers, no matter what happens to jobs, to factories, or to producers. The results of their Keynesian economics are wrecking every industrial country, but they refuse to question their basic assumptions. The examples of Soviet Russia, of Nazi Germany, of Red China, of Marxist Chile, of Socialist England are multiplying around them, but they refused to see and to learn. Today, production is the world's most urgent need, and the threat of starvation is spreading through the globe. The intellectuals know the only economic system that can and did produce unlimited abundance, but they gave it no thought and kept silent about it, as if it were, as if it had never existed. It is almost irrelevant to blame them for the default at the task of intellectual leadership. The smallness of their stature is overwhelming. Is there any hope for the future of this country? Yes, there is. This country has one asset left, the matchless productive ability of its people. If, and to the extent that, this ability is liberated, we might still have a chance to avoid a collapse. We cannot expect to reach the ideal overnight, but we must at least reveal its name. We must reveal to this country the secret which all those posturing intellectuals of any political domination who clamor for openness and truth are trying so hard to cover up, that the name of this miraculous productive system is capitalism. And to say such things as taxes and the rebuilding of this country, I will say that in his goals, if not his methods, the best economist in Atlas Shrugged was Ragnar Daneskjold. And that's the end of chapter 12, Egalitarianism and Inflation. And as I mentioned before, this is a chapter that's full of malevolent universe kind of premises where failure is to be expected, and I think she might be trying to say yes, consequences, that there's consequences for the actions, but that the whole idea is that the world's economy and the country's economy is going to eventually collapse. This was written in 1974, and it is, excuse me, not so today. It hasn't collapsed, and I think in part we did find with technology that the average American worker has become even more productive than they had been before. Also, one of the things that we hadn't counted on, I think, in 1974 was the strength of and the needs of the Chinese economy, which I think has delayed a reckoning, a point where we get to a climax and decide we've got to make some tough decisions right now, or else we are going to end up in some type of a global depression. Also, she mentions John Maynard Keynes, which I had mentioned before, and that he is the one that created this system. What she fails to mention is why he did it, and that it was done in order to create the promise of not only American life, but as far as Mr. Keynes is concerned, the promise of life, period, life on Earth. And that is to have ever-increasing prosperity, because that's the goal of Keynesian economics, is to avoid recessions, avoid depressions, and have ever-increasing prosperity so that my children will earn more than me, their children will earn more than them, etc., etc. And now, like I said, I'm the only true conservative in the United States of America because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. I'm the only conservative that really understands that what makes you a conservative is not your status or your position on abortion, but your position on change. And if you make the presumption for the status quo, as I do, then you're conservative. If you make the presumption for change, no matter whether you vote for Republicans, whether you vote the straight conservative ticket, no matter what, then you are a socialist. Now, as far as being the socialist or a conservative is concerned, making the presumption of the status quo, in this particular case, the status quo is Keynesian economics. So, under what case would we be looking for change? Is there a prima facie case, an obvious case for change? Well, you got to ask, for what purpose was Keynesian economics introduced? It was to avoid recessions, depressions, and have an economy, a world economy, that continued to expand. Never contracted, only expanded. and it failed. And it has failed, and it's failed over and over and over again, and it will fail again in the future. So it has been a failure. What do you do when you fail on something? If you try an experiment and it doesn't work, you go back to the drawing board. Try and learn lessons from it. What is it that didn't work? See if that your theory is salvageable. And in the meantime, you go back to what you were doing before. In this particular case, what we should be doing is going back to the gold standard, putting the country on a gold standard, either at the very least a partial gold standard where each dollar is backed by a certain amount of physical gold. Or even better yet, like I said, is we trade in gold, we trade in specie. It would be beneficial for lots of reasons. We'd still end up with an economy that would have a tendency to rise and fall, that we will still have some recessions. We might even have depressions, but we will have a lot of other advantages. Number one is that inflation. We don't have to, not going to have to worry about inflation because with a gold economy, the economy has a tendency to be deflationary. Since gold is a finite commodity and therefore its value has a tendency to go up. And so you increase your buying power every year. That means prices go down. It also means that wages will have a tendency to go down as well. But that means we don't need a minimum wage since wages have to go up. Also, it means that we don't need banks for interest, for CDs, because in an inflationary economy, you've got to do something to stay ahead of inflation. So you've got to have banks and brokerage houses and use those brokerage houses and have 401ks and invest in stocks and bonds and whatnot so that you can get a sufficient return to be able to help you stay ahead of inflation. Well, in a gold economy, since it happens to be deflationary, you don't need Wall Street. You don't need the banks in order to stay ahead of an inflation because there isn't any. Also, one of the other advantages to a gold standard economy is the return of value. You're not going to go out and buy junk. You're not going. The whole idea now is you get things and you get them as cheap as you can. You buy now, you buy cheap products. A year or so later, they break. You throw them away because they're not worth fixing, and you buy another one. So that's part of the consumer mentality. Breaks, throw it away, buy something else. That breaks, throw it away, buy something else. With a gold economy, you're not going to turn over to a store gold coins or any type of gold, even dollars that are backed by gold, for plastic, for cheap, for crap. You're going to demand quality. That things are going to be made out of precious metals, that things are going to be made out of nice woods, that they're going to be crafted well, they're going to be put together well, they're going to be solid, they're going to be reliable, and in the advent that it does break, whatever it is that you've purchased, it's worth fixing. It becomes more economic or economical to go ahead and have the item fixed than to go ahead and throw it away and buy something else. Because again, you've taken your hard-earned money and that's worth something, your gold, and exchanged it for this particular product. Classic example from the inflationary side of this is the case of I just went out and I got a Timex. Get a Timex watch for $20, right? So if the watch breaks, there's nobody around really to repair it, and you wouldn't want to get it repaired anyways because it would probably cost more than what the watch is worth. So you throw it away and go buy yourself another $20 watch. But not only when it breaks, but this watch will then be running on a battery. So if you're going to get even if you don't bother to take it to a jewelry store to get the battery replaced, which might cost you $15 to do, and you just go buy the battery for say $5, how many times are you going to be able to put the battery back, update or change the batteries and spend that kind of money without it becoming cost effective, about 4 times. Technically, you might not even want to do it once because again, it's plastic, it's junk. So as soon as the battery runs out, the motivation right there is to throw it in the trash and go buy something else. So that's where we get our throwaway society, this society in which we are putting tons and tons of trash into landfills because of, thanks to John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics. Okay, so today's Thursday, and we just finished chapter 12 for Philosophy Who Needs It. Tomorrow is going to be a Storytime Extra, and then Saturday and Sunday, I'm going to be reading, at least Saturday, chapter 13, The Stimulus and the Response from Philosophy Who Needs It. But until tomorrow, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.